For the first two Sundays in Lent, our Gospel readings on Sundays came from the Gospel according to Mark. Now we turn today to the Gospel according to John, and indeed for the next two coming Sundays, the Gospel readings are from John's Gospel as well. Perhaps surprisingly, today's Gospel reading is that of the cleansing of the temple, John chapter 2, verses 13 to 22. An angry Jesus comes into the temple, discovering it's overtaken by the money changers. He turns over their tables, he casts them out. He loudly, and indeed in John's Gospel it's quite clear, angrily asks them whether or not they have actually not turned his Father's house, the house of prayer, into a den of thieves. A lot of commentators have worried that Jesus is thereby in some way not just a social revolutionary, but is in fact turning people out from their livelihoods. The money changers there, maybe we don't necessarily applaud what they were doing, but were in meaningful employment. They would change the money, because ordinary day-to-day money was not acceptable for paying tribute in the temple, into the special temple talents that had to be surrendered by those who were faithful. They would also no doubt sell pigeons and the like, although we are mercifully spared those in most representations in art that depict this great scene. Why is it that this particular lection should suddenly appear during the course of our observance of Lent? In Mark's Gospel, the account of Jesus in the temple and the money changers comes almost immediately after the entry on Palm Sunday, and that would seem to explain why it turns up at this calendar year, at this season in the calendar. One of the famous paintings of this scene is a depiction by the Greek painter El Greco, who came to live for most of his working life in Spain in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. In this depiction we see Jesus robed in purple, or at least in red, in the middle with a flail, scattering those men and women on either side of him, who in surprise and shock, and their gestures are somewhat overdone by the artist, are reeling away from him. How is it that Jesus, who comes to call all to himself, should somehow spurn others? Why should Jesus, who is the friend of sinners, and so often is found throughout the Gospel account as being a friend of those who are friendless, those on the margin of society, why should the same Jesus react so strongly in this particular story in the Gospel? The reason, I suspect, is simply that this is the house of prayer. This is intended to be the very gate to heaven. This is God's house, and God's house deserves respect. Jesus undoubtedly welcomed those on the fringes of society and went out of his way, as the Gospel accounts tell us repeatedly, to meet with and to talk to those who were otherwise discarded or discouraged by society. Women, prostitutes, felons, publicans, and the like form the day-to-day company whom Jesus deliberately seeks out. Here in the temple, however, those who are buying and selling, those who have turned the house of prayer into a mere commercial venture, are to be thrown out. They detract from what is the sure purpose of worshipping God. We too, in our daily lives, will often find it is the material things that obstruct us in our worship of God. Not necessarily because we want to give more gainful time to making money than to saying our prayers or going to church, although that may be true for some, but rather because the tensions of trying to survive in our world, with its material demands, quite often can cut across our better intentions to spend more time serving God, whether directly in approaching the temple, whether it might be in saying our prayers, or more broadly in spending time generously offering freely to others, acts of charity and acts of service. If we would follow the world and therefore put a price on everything, valuing our time in certain ways such that we resent time given to others freely, whether members of our family or members of our friends, or indeed those who have most call upon us, those in hospital, those who are ill, those who are lonely, then we have already begun to lose something of God's inner call in our lives. If we would follow Jesus, take up our cross and follow him, we need to give freely of both our time and our generosity, and that means perhaps more costly than our own money, but finding the time in our lives to serve others, to undertake acts of charity and to act generously. The temple that becomes debased by the mere commercial activity of the moneylenders is still nonetheless the place in which God has chosen to dwell. We too, in our search for God and seeking to be in that place where God has chosen to dwell, need to ensure that our own spiritual preparation is such that it is not marred by the material or by the materialistic.